right. Jeanette Fitzsimon's Economy of Enough, we do stretch out and address other issues as well. And this is one of those. I also want to welcome, if there are listeners here or participants from Extinction Rebellion, you will no doubt be familiar with the activities in which they have been busy in Wellington. I don't want to either condemn or condone the blocking of traffic, but I would just like to point out that of the international organizations for demands, one of them is for governments to move beyond politics and to set up the practice of citizens' assemblies. So it seems the relevance for us. I won't spend time introducing our two speakers. They can do that much more adequately themselves. So I welcome Kristiann and Tatjana and leave you in their good hands.
Great.
Am I on? Yes, I am. Hi. Thank you so much, Pat, for the lovely introduction and for inviting us, myself and my colleague Tatjana from Koitu, the Center for Informed Futures at the University of Auckland. Tēnā koutou katoa, thank you. Nā mihi nui, ko Kristiann Allen, aho, ko Koitu Center for Informed Futures, te whare mahi at the University of Auckland. So today, my colleague Tatjana and I are going to take you through a bit of a journey of our discovery and our research around citizens' assemblies. It starts from professional and personal interests and takes us all the way through to New Zealand's first citizens' assembly with quite a strong remit that we'll tell you about that came from water care. But I'll just quickly hand it to my colleague Tatjana to introduce herself as well before I bring up our slides.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Tatjana Buklijas, and I am Kristiann's colleague at Koitu, University of Auckland, Center for Informed Futures, University of Auckland. I am also senior lecturer in global studies and director of Europe Institute. So that's what I also wanted to ask. So as Kristiann said, we will tell you a little bit of a story of how we got to do what is the first citizens assembly. We think it was the first citizens assembly. I don't want to be absolutely 100% sure. And then we want to kind of end with a bit of kind of discussion around deliberative democracy citizens assembly internationally and where it could take us, in particular around the problem of climate change, which is why you are interested. I think you may need to maybe mute more people. There's a little
yes, so some people unmuted. Please make sure that you are in the corner of your screen. Thank you, Tatjana. Sorry about that.
Yeah. All right, I'm handing it over to Kristiann, who is going to start.
Great. Okay. I will attempt to share screens. So whoever's the host, is that
come up with any ideas there?
Somebody has to let me share screens.
Jack, if you're still there, please can you share screen with Thank you. Okay.
Okay, so I'll give it a go again. It doesn't seem to come through.
It usually works. Jack, another go, please.
Just takes a moment.
Yeah. Here we go. All right. That's about right. And then there. Good. Is that all right? Everybody seeing it? Yes. Okay, great. All right, now I don't want to see myself, so I'll put myself there. Great. Okay. So we are here to talk to you about complex conversations on a complex question. Somebody else maybe? Yeah, thanks. Complex conversations on a complex question, and Citizens Assembly on the big question, which was that what is the next source of water, or what should be the next source of water for Auckland? And we'll tell you about how we got to that question through our work with water care. So just to start, quick overview of what we want to talk to you about today. So we'll, like I said, tell you our story, our background on the project, on ourselves and the project and how we came to it. We'll talk to you about how the project was set up. So the making of this, what we call complex conversations. And Tatjana will sort of walk you through a bit of the theory on participatory democracy as well as deliberative democracy, which is where this project lands, and then a bit about the water care collaboration. And then I'll come back and talk to you about what it actually looked like on the ground when we pulled it all together over the course of several weeks. And then Tatjana will tell you about some of the challenges we encountered and how we responded to those. It's relevant, as Pat said at the outset, to understand these types of challenges, because, you know, if this is going to become a new sort of wave of new wave of democracy, then we really need to understand what it is we're working with, and also what we're up against and how to respond. And then finally ending with some of the prospects for using this to respond to our shared climate challenge. So I'll just dive in with our story. So where we came from is maybe a bit relevant to this, and that is most of us on this project, at least from the university side, were staff members in the inaugural Chief Science Advisor's Office. So we worked with Sir Peter Gluckman from some of us from the beginning, 2009, all the way to 2018. I came from Canada, actually, in about 2013, and I came from work in the Canadian federal science system. So my interest has always been around that science policy society interface, but from the policymaker side. So our office, even back when it was the Chief Science Advisor's Office, was really, interestingly, I thought, really staffed with a lot of humanities, social science scholars, as well as medical sciences and environmental sciences scholars. We have expertise in evidence synthesis and brokering, that is to say, looking across different types of evidence and brokering that to the policy community. And in doing that work, one of the things that really struck us was, though that office, I think, has been quite successful over the years, there was somewhat of an inability, really, to look at really long-term questions and complex questions, because working with policy, you find yourself almost dealing with the day-to-day or dealing with the the medium term, and not really being able to grapple with the bigger pieces, and also just not having the type of platform to have those big conversations that require, you know, the collective action issues. And so that was the gap that we really identified and thought, okay, well, this is a great team. If we return to the university now after the Chief Science Advisor's Office, can we pull this together and actually make something of it? So was really our starting point in looking at these big long-term questions. And it was the birth of COI2, the Center for Informed Futures. I'll just hand it to Tatjana to tell you a little bit more about where she's coming from.
Yeah, so and in addition to this official story, there was a kind of personal and private story. I live in Onehunga, and in 2017, I returned from a fellowship in Europe, and I learned about a new motorway that you may all know about that was meant to be built along the northern shore of Manukau Harbour, East-West Link. And I was shocked. No, it was actually 2016, sorry, when I came back. And I was shocked, and I realized that this was under discussion for years, and we didn't really know much about it. And there was a board of inquiry being about to set up, and there was an opportunity to submit as you know, as a sort of citizen, as a submitter. I had a lot of objections against East-West Link, as did many of the citizens of Onehunga. It was going to destroy what was left of the shores of Onehunga. It was going to destroy the kind of fabric of social community. Also, building a motorway at the time of pressing realization of the need to reduce carbon emissions seemed like an incredibly strange decision. So I went to kind of naively thinking that there is sort of space to go as a submitter and present. And I faced the reality of what it actually means to submit in a board of inquiry, and sort of realizing, although I was fairly used to public speaking, although I could present a reasonably, I think, supported case, because I could draw on my academic research skills, I could ask my colleagues, that actually going there, I had the experience of feeling really powerless as a citizen, feeling feeling quite dejected by the very the power inequity that was felt and in this court. And then I was thinking, because it is like a court, as you may know, it's a really court-like atmosphere. And then I was thinking, what is it like then for other people who are not academics, who do not have resources like I do, of knowledge, of time, of access to experts, and they may be affected by these kinds of decisions. They may be living under this motorway, under this tentative motorway, and they just won't be able to submit. And yet this process was explained and in law as something that was open to everybody. And this kind of made me really think that at the same time, when Kristiann and others were also thinking about approaching complex issues, like how do we actually build a process that it's more equitable, more inclusive, and actually enables people, everybody to participate, but participate in a sort of more informed way. So next slide, Kristiann. And I think we can just, and the next slide was really the kind of the question that we actually landed on is, can we redesign the way that government and public organizations engage with citizens around complex issues? Right, so next slide is that then kind of like going back is what is the board of inquiry, and what is the kind of basic principles upon which board of inquiry and other ways in which citizens participate beyond the representative democracy. So meaning like everything that's participatory democracy today. Town halls, sort of submissions, environmental court, and of course the big ones, even royal commissions, and theoretically where everybody can participate, but really only very few people really can and do, because resources to support participation are necessary, but they're not accessible to everybody, and they're not guaranteed. So, and also the result of these processes is really the aggregation of individual opinions, which in many cases public organizations and government do not actually know how to put together. So as you may know, it's sort of not clear to council, to other organizations, what do they do with a submission that comes, say, from your organization, and how does it weigh more this submission like that than one individual submission, and so forth. And of course, but we know that this participatory democracy is actually very well embedded in legislation in New Zealand, in RMA, which is now over 38 years old, and of course the Local Government Act, as you know, in 2002. Next slide, Kristiann. And so the question obviously was, for us, was also like, so where, why do we have them? Why do we have this form of participation so deeply embedded in the policy structures in our government, in the way that public organizations work, and how is this participation really conceived? So I won't next slide, Kristiann. I won't dwell too much about this, but it did kind of lead us to a little bit of a historical research that started in this post-war democratic theory, and actually really rethinking what democracy is. This kind of, because thinking about democracy is really kind of this eternal struggle between, do we think that people are able to think and participate directly? And is this really what democracy is all about? Or do we think that people's abilities and duties really kind of stop and start at elections? And then we rely on our elected representatives to do the duty of actually deciding and deliberating on our behalf. And there was a kind of time in the 60s and 70s, and some of people here may know this very well, when there was quite a strong kind of how shall I say, stream of thinking that participation is really the way to think about democratic theory. And you can see reflections of this thinking across many fields. urban planning. And partly this was also a how shall I say, sort of a response to the way that communities, less powerful communities, were destroyed in the course of building cities in 60s and 70s. And this was kind of a way to bring them into urban planning. And there was also kind of thinking participatory thinking in organizational psychology, which was about work and participation and how people who feel that they participate in their work can actually be producing more. So there was a lot of kind of this participatory thinking through the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, and this is how it really came in. With the best intentions, it became embedded into our legislation. The problem was, however, and then as this was discovered in not only in New Zealand, and as we could see, is that if you just sort of invite people to participate and do not actually support them, what kind of ends up is generally that they will not participate, or that their participation can take forms that are really exactly the opposite of what we actually wanted. So next slide. Some of you may know this. There were many kind of schematic representations of the forms of participation in our democratic lives, and this one is one of the oldest ones and one of the possibly best known ones. It's called the ladder of participation, which sort of ranks, which sort of thinks about participation. In this case, it was in urban planning, but you can take it into kind of your democratic life from basically kind of the most the sort of the position of least power, where basically the participant is manipulated by those who have more power, to the kind of highest positions of where citizens have the full control over decisions. The next slide, Kristiann. To something like these contemporary models, is the well-known IAP2 model, which is used a lot to kind of describe both what happens in these participatory processes, and also as a kind of form to depict where do we want to go. So often organizations want to go towards this sort of right-hand side of the slide, where you can see this, where people and whoever convenes the process, be it like in the case of I don't know, government organizations, are in this kind of equal positions. What happens in real life is that rarely is the case. And even when you have, and we can talk about it, like why is that? And is even, something like having this empower position where the final decision is really in the hands of the public is really possible. But we will kind of see these sort of these schemes in many, many places. However, like where we landed was that we actually wanted to try something a little bit different. So the next slide. And in our research, we came across this field that sort of developed alongside and from and in parallel to participatory democracy. And this is deliberative democracy that takes some of the characteristics of participatory and sort of assumes citizen participation, but sort of adds some other components to this. So can I have the next slide? So just very briefly, and we can talk a lot, and because this is what we do and what we've been trying, deliberative democracy sort of assumes citizen participation, but says that it's not really enough to just bring people in and say, okay, you can now participate and give us your opinion. But it says what we need to actually know and what we need to have is, the important thing is actually to have the informed reason giving. And rather than having the aggregation of individual opinions, we want people to come to a shared ground. And we can, sometimes we use the word consensus. It also has quite negative connotations. So, I mean, let's sort of prefer to sort of a place where, no one's unhappy and everybody, what we call in our process, can live with. So this was the first wave of deliberative democracy research and thinking, sort of with the work of Habermas and Rawls in sort of late 80s, 1990s. But then soon there were objections to that and said, well, we need to also consider the power relations and the fact that we cannot assume that, just having a group of citizens to deliberate is actually enough. We need to actually have all the groups that make up the society represented. So there has to be diversity, and it also has to be organized in a way that guarantees inclusivity to this process. So this was the kind of the second wave around 2000 and the early 2000s that brought this kind of thinking, who needs to be in the room. And then finally, what was happening about like last around 10 or 15 years is that there's been a huge wave of experimentation in empirical deliberative democracy, which means having many different processes around the world that take these kind of three key principles of having a randomly selected representative groups of citizens deliberate in a space that's inclusive, they have enough time, they're given resources, they have the commitment of whoever is summoning the process that their recommendations will be taken seriously and at least considered, and if not fully implemented. And then they sort of ask to make these kind of recommendations at the end of their process. And there's kind of the fourth wave, which is happening now, is kind of how do we make these deliberative processes as a part of deliberative system. But for us, this kind of empirical thing was really the important, and which kind of brought us to our, so Kristiann, next slide. So this is the criteria. Then we started to think about what is the good question, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. What is a good question for a deliberative process? It's a question that involves values, involves trade-offs, where we need to have different types of knowledge involved. These are questions that are often looking at long-term future, and they go beyond electoral cycles. Sort of, I mean, you will all think about like, what do we do in terms of climate change? And this is why it's one of them. And it's never a yes or no question. It has to be a question that's sort of more substantial and requires some sort of more elaborate answer as well. So the next one, and so this is, so just one more. So this is how we got from participatory democracy, deliberative democracy. So next click, Kristiann. Our research questions. So our questions like, could we replace the current participatory processes with deliberative ones? Then it was, what kind of policy questions can they answer? So they satisfy criteria. And then really importantly is like, how do we make sure that the processes that we have seen overseas actually fit into the conditions and the context of our country today, meaning that how do they both uphold the totality of Waitangi obligations and the rights of mana whenua holders, while also reflecting the sort of reality of our country today. And this is the multiculturalism of our citizens, in particular in Auckland. And then we got this, I'm making it sound very easy, but we got the grant to do the project. And the important thing, next slide, and this is where I will end, is that we developed this collaboration with Watercare. And it's a kind of interesting story in itself how that happened. But let's just say that Watercare was really interested in deliberative democracy because they had some experiences in Australia, and they were interested in trialing that out. And they had a question. Their question was, what should be the next source of water for Auckland? And they said after 2040. And for us, this question fitted all of our criteria, that it was a kind of this long-term question that involved trade-offs, it was values-based, and it was definitely not a yes or no question. And as sort of this slide also says, it was an opportunity to try the question in the research project. Our research project initially wanted to try some fictional scenarios. And it was also an opportunity for us to trial working with a non-academic department. So it was about trialing and transdisciplinary collaboration. Okay, over to you, Kristiann.
Great, thank you for that history. That was fabulous. So talking a little bit now about the project itself. Tatjana mentioned this was our opportunity to trial working with a public organization like this in this space, but it was also an opportunity for them to test out working with the university. And of course, when you are in a relationship like that, working with the university, it is a research project. And so there was a little bit of negotiation and discussion around what we needed from the project as researchers in terms of testing this proof of concept. And so we broke this project into 3 different phases. over the course of the funding that we got. And I think Tatjana might have mentioned that this was a grant that was from MBIE, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Entrepreneurship,
Yeah.
or no, Employment. Business, Innovation and Employment. And so they are the lead funder for academic research that is directed research. And some of you may know this already. So it's the research that is, it has quite a directed focus. It has to culminate in either a thing or a process or something that is more immediately useful than, say, sort of just contributing to the literature. So this is a very directed type of research. MB was interested in it, obviously, and we were lucky enough to get it after writing the grant. We didn't write the grant with water care in mind, and Tatjana sort of alluded to the fact that that was a bit of a serendipitous process. And in retrospect now, I'm not sure how we would have sort of tested this without that strong remit coming from a summoning organization. We had sort of theoretical ideas in mind around all sorts of things, big sort of complex questions that required this kind of public input. But without that summoning organization, we found later, that's what was able to hold it up. So what did we do? Just really quickly, started with doing quite a lot of focus groups, consultations, talking with practitioners in this space. So, and there are practitioners in this space in local government, all the way up through to central government, who are really looking at what it means to be, to go beyond consultation in policy making. And so that was really the whole first phase of the project, is trying to sort of do our own intelligence gathering, I guess, and trying to get our own heads around what it meant to be deliberative in decision making. And I should say too that Tatjana has had a student on board as well, working alongside, who was doing a master's thesis in looking at the other side of that question. Was there an appetite on the part of elected officials to almost relinquish that kind of decision-making power? And so that was something that she had been looking into in a master's thesis, and did interviews around that as well. Then we moved into sort of the 1.2 kind of phase, halfway, and that was to test out the framing of a question, because this is really the sort of second piece of the puzzle. Is, okay, you might have a remit or you have an organization that wants to launch a remit, but what type of question really is needed, and how do you frame that so that it's answerable in the space of time that you have for deliberation, and in this very inclusive context? And so we tested that out by asking our question over the course of, I think we did 4 different workshops in different, we limited it to Tamaki Makaurau, and we did in different areas of Auckland, because we all know that the demographics are different across the city depending where you go. The socioeconomic status is different, and we just wanted to sort of test out in these sort of little enclaves, I suppose, how the question could be asked, and what kind of feedback we got from the group. So we did that over the course of the first year, and also tested out these ideas of how do we recruit, to get this random selection process, and really testing all of our design principles for doing something like this. And the people who were involved in that obviously knew that they were involved in sort of that sort of upstream research part of our project. It wasn't yet the citizens assembly. And as far as we were concerned, that's where it could have ended. We were testing out, the design principles, how this might work, and ready to almost write up a report. But because we were working with water care, they said, hey, hold on a second, this is really just very preliminary for us. We want to go further. And so they cajoled. they I think through negotiation and discussion, and because it was a really great team to work with, we agreed to, let's do this. Let's just go all in and try to develop the Citizens Assembly. And what convinced us to continue this with them was truly the commitment of water care in saying, look, we're going to ask this question about the next source of water for Auckland, and what gives strength to this remit that we're giving the citizens involved in this is that we will commit to them that we would have to have a good reason to not follow their recommendations. And so when we heard that, we heard sort of true commitment. And that was what convinced us that we should just throw caution to the wind and try this. So that's what we did. So I'll tell you a little bit now about exactly that, our Citizens Assembly on the Future of Water in Auckland. So I'll just take you through first how we got to the question itself that was being asked. And then I want to show you some of the material that we made available to the members. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about the recruitment and the mechanics, I guess, of that process before handing it back to Tatjana. So the problem itself on the next source of water stems from a commitment that came from Water Care. And it was really a commitment that was, I mean, you could relate it right back to Tiriti o Waitangi. And it's a commitment to the mana whenua of Waikato to say we will no longer, or we will not increase our water take from the Waikato River. So that was their starting point, is to say, you know, understanding our obligations in Tamaki Makaurau to Waikato under the Treaty of Waitangi, we need to sort this out. We cannot continue to up our take, and knowing that Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland was going to grow, that there would be more demand for water, it was really important to start having this conversation sooner rather than later. And so it was driven really by those kind of requirements. And then what they were trying to, I guess, the criteria that they were trying to meet in choosing the next source or sources of water for Auckland were really what you see here. It had to be something, it had to be a source that was able to meet peak demand. It had to be climate resilient. It had to be environmentally responsible in the way that you see defined here. I'll come back to socially acceptable, and then it had to be cost effective. And so balancing these criteria or juggling them, working through these criteria really is something that not only requires input, but requires discussion and deliberation. And this is, you know, this is the new wave of policymaking. It's not centralized command and control. And like we said at the outset, these are the types of questions that are beyond consultation. They really do require this deliberation that is more than just the aggregate of individuals' opinions. Now, why did I skip over socially acceptable? That, of course, is a criteria, but in getting to it, that was the process that we were putting together itself, is the deliberative citizens assembly process. So everybody assembled at the assembly needed to deal with these other 1, 2, 3, 4 criteria, but they themselves being there were helping Water Care to meet that 5th one, that socially acceptable criteria. So that was really our starting point. And I'll take you through now what were the 6 options that were presented at the outset. And again, I want to stress that it was never presented as, please choose one of these and we're done. It was, think about these as possibilities and see if it is 1, if it's 2, if it's a combination, you tell us. The other thing that Water Care had done in terms of sort of the background work on this is they had truly gone out to experts over the course of several months, crunching down from, you know, hundreds of possible options, including the very far-flung, I mean, the realm of science fiction. Could we, I think one of the Water Care experts said, could we, you know, haul up a chunk of iceberg from Antarctica and somehow store that water somewhere? So they weren't leaving anything off the table, but it sounds farcical, but really he was making the point that they had really looked at all possibilities and narrowed it to these 6, and then wanted the feedback from the public. And so the first was an obvious one. Let's just reduce demand. Start by reducing demand. And you can see on the side here the criteria that meets or doesn't meet. and whether or not it would be, one of the viable options. I won't sort of talk through all of this, but you get the idea in terms of using more efficient appliances, creating more sort of living building type of concepts where you're reusing gray water at home, and making that as part of code, that kind of thing. And then looking at how commercial development could be reusing water. And so all sorts of different efficiencies. That was one of the options. And of course, the people in the assembly got a lot of background information about each of these and expert input. A second one was around purified recycled water, but doing this in an indirect way. So purified recycled water, you can imagine what that is. This is our wastewater, then gets purified, recycled. The idea of indirect in this sense is that it would be purified to a drinking quality, but it would be stored and allowed to settle and then repurified again in a second process before it goes out and through your pipes to your homes. And you can see here the criteria that would have essentially met. A third one, the same thing really, but without that second step to settle in storage and go back through the system before it comes to you. So this is much more direct. It is, of course, to a drinking standard, and all of the fail safes that get put into that to make sure that's to a drinking standard. And the citizens in the deliberative group, of course, had access to experts to ensure, to really get that quality assessment and ensure that there would be, they really wanted to know what are the fail safes that would be in place to make sure that this is drinking quality water. Then the option of desalination was, of course, on the table. We've seen this elsewhere in the world, and the group was really interested in the viability of this one, but became less interested as they learned more about what it does with the brine being released back into the sea, back into the ocean, and really creating that super salty area that is inhospitable to what is there now. So that became less popular as they realized what would happen to the Hauraki Gulf under that circumstance. So with this then, this is just, I won't walk through this, but it's just an example of the material. We created a booklet that everybody had access to just before the assembly, and they could walk through for themselves all of the material before we met. And all of these options were in there, including other links to other expert sources. Again, just a sample of what we're presenting in that booklet is, this again, along with the Waikato, not taking from the Waikato anymore. This was part of the argument of why we needed to have this assembly, is that there is increasing demand, and it's driven by unpredictable climate. It's driven by intensification of the population, growth of the population, and of course, economic development and demand for water. So it's predictable that we would have needed more water, or a more secure source of water going forward. So then just the mechanics of recruitment really quickly, where we started, as Tatjana said, in terms of design principles, recruitment is really key for this. A random selection of people. We were aiming for 36 people in the assembly. We started with 12,000 invitations that went out through two databases, the WaterCare database and the NZ Post database. Some of you may have received an invitation. You may even have submitted a response asking to be invited. And if you didn't get an invitation, don't blame us. You can blame the algorithm that we used, which is a sortition algorithm that really looks for balancing that by demographics. So we use the census, I think the 2018 census, and sort of the categories that we were looking for were age, gender, ethnicity, education, but also home ownership and home ownership status, so owners versus renters, so that we could really, as Tatjana said, get that mix of people that was absolutely representative of Auckland. Okay, and so just walking you through what it looked like then on the day, as they say, or the multiple days, we started our first meeting. These are all Saturday meetings. So people are giving their time and they are meeting on a Saturday, coming together, learning together with each other. We had an introduction. We had, I won't go through it. I'll do it very quickly because we're probably running out of time. A day of deliberation. Importantly, hearing from experts was really key here. They had access to experts from water care. They had access to international experts. They had access to experts from the university that we really made an effort to bring together. They had the access to experts also in between sessions online for anything that they missed. And that's where we took input from the group to know what they wanted to know about. And importantly, on day 3, so that's the 3rd meeting over the course of, I think we're probably at week 6 or 7 now, they met with Mana Whenua, the Kaitiaki Forum, and that was also really key. And having it on day 3, I think, was really key too, because there were, of course, Māori in the group, but not necessarily Mana Whenua. And meeting them on day 3 was important because everybody had come to a much greater understanding of what they were doing, of the issues and of the options. And then it was time to understand what it meant in context. And of course, the final meeting was crunch time, and that was report writing and recommendations, where we had the CEO of Watercare come and receive these recommendations. So these have been made public, I think, on the Watercare website as of yesterday or today. But to briefly summarize, the main recommendation was, you know what, let's go for recycled water direct was the option that was chosen, but to continue to research desalination and to think seriously about implementing desalination when the cost comes down, but also, and most importantly, when the environmental feasibility has a better outlook than it does now. They also, over the course of that time, wanted to ensure that implementing the water efficiency methods and education was something that Watercare was doing across the city. There was one, what we call a minority report. So a couple of people thought that this public engagement from Watercare should continue, and Watercare has committed to do that. I'll hand it to Tatjana.
And it was interesting that there was a minority report, but the Watercare agreed anyway to do it.
Sorry, I didn't catch that whole question?
We've lost it.
Okay, we can come back.
Yeah,
So
they
Tatjana,
can come back
this
later.
one's yours.
Yeah. So I mean, I just want to kind of briefly, and this is something we can discuss in the questions, to a few questions and challenges that we thought a lot before, during, after, was, of course, how do we honor our obligations towards Te Tiriti o Waitangi? And in particular, you know, in the case where we were not creating this question with Mana Whenua, we were not creating it with Māori organizations. It was asked by Watercare. Of course, Watercare works with Mana Whenua Forum. There's a kind of a continuous process of talking through them, but we couldn't sort of say that this was co-created with Mana Whenua. So we were thinking a lot like, how do we ensure to the best ability that there is, and also kind of how do we make this process so that it's broadly usable across New Zealand as, and then as we were kind of realizing that it will not be the same in a city like Tamaki Makaurau with 19 iwi, and in a small city where there's sort of one, you know, sort of rohe overlaps with an iwi. So what we did, we talked a lot with our colleagues in Koitu, who are Māori scholars, Indigenous political theorists. We worked before the process, we sort of shared our design with the Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum and Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, and we got some feedback, but actually they really started to show interest only when the process started. And then once they actually came to the process, when they came to day 3, then they really sort of decided that actually this was a process they could sort of live with, really. And they found it interesting. And actually, when the citizen produced the first draft of their recommendations after the day 3, we sent it to Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum, and they received a short feedback to their responses. and then that kind of also fed into their final response. Of course, one kind of other big question was also how does this fit? And this is again something we can talk about later. Where would a process like this, like the one by water care, fit in the policy process in New Zealand today? And this is, would local boards see running a mini public conflict with their purpose, because they were set up and they are elected to represent the citizens, right? So, and we have been talking with the local government review panel, and as you may know, they've recently published the draft report about 3 days ago. And you can see that some of the input that we were giving and some of their thinking about how deliberative democracy could potentially fulfill the gap that we feel there exists today in local government, due to the fact that actually the local government, the people are not represented, that actually people who stand for local government do not represent their communities, that often they're not equipped and they don't have time or space to actually deliberate on specific problems. So there's some discussion to be had. And then there are some operational issues. If we were to use it in New Zealand, do we have the capabilities, the cost? How do we, do we have people to facilitate these kinds of things? So what we did was we had an experienced facilitator. We sought advice from Australia. How would this scale up to the country is the kind of question that we need to discuss. And this is where we, I think, finished, Kristiann, about the assembly. And we had a couple of slides that were more like to prompt a discussion around the issues of climate change and deliberative democracy. Over to you, Kristiann.
Great, thank you. Yeah, exactly. So just to draw this to a close a little bit, we thought we would come back to some of the elements that might interest you in your own work and your own interests. And so the framework that we thought might be useful to help us think where deliberative democracy practices could be applied is the framework from the Sustainable Development Goals, but almost the Sustainable Development Goals 2.0, which is really looking more at transformation. So not goal by goal. Some of you may know and have memorized all 17 goals, but really what are when we group them together, what are the main transformations that we're really talking about? I think we're beyond the language of challenges now. We're talking about actual big societal transformations. And so you can think of any number of questions under these transformations around food, biosphere, and water, around how cities will have to change and shift, all of the stuff around infrastructure and transportation within that. Decarbonizing, of course, has transportation questions as well. Food and consumption, how that whole system will have to shift. And then, of course, the big transformations that are related to the digital revolution and demographic shifts as well. So these are kind of coming from the United Nations Sustainable Development thinkers about what are those big transformations. And we thought, there are probably questions. In fact, we're certain there are questions under each of these major transformations that we're going to see in the next, few decades that could be well applied in a deliberative process. And so just coming back now to those criteria, this is more of a thought, provoker than anything else, is to think about those criteria of what makes a good deliberative process, what makes a good question, and who would issue the remit under these main sort of headline problems, I suppose. What would they look like? Who would issue the remit, and how would we bring this together? You can think of, like I said, any number of things around transportation policy settings, around land use questions, food systems, policy settings. And so, yeah, it's about figuring out together what that question would be and issuing a strong remit that meets these criteria. And then I'll just let Tatjana wrap it up with some last thoughts around what's happening currently.
Yeah, I just want to say that I know that for this group and many group, the reason why they became interested in deliberative democracy are the climate assemblies at the kind of national level. And we know that UK ran their climate assembly with the question of how do we reach net zero by 2015. They ran it in early 2020. France ran their climate assembly with the question, how do we reduce carbon emissions by 40%? And these are the kind of these climate assemblies that were really sort of captivated the attention of the world. That is sort of big, the politicians really trying to, in some way to kind of use citizens to make the tough political decisions that they felt they could not politically easily make. And these assemblies produced some very good recommendations. Now, I know that there was criticisms around them. Some came from groups who were more radical, like Extinction Rebellion, who thought that these recommendations did not go far enough. At the same time, these recommendations were not fully implemented, or not even implemented, like even, I mean, fully, when I mean that's only a small part, and we can talk about it whether whether this is actually a problem about the assemblies or a general problem of implementation. But I also want to say that maybe the easier way to start to work on climate change is really around the local questions. And here I agree with the academic Rebecca Willis in the UK, who says that often the easier way to make climate change tangible to people is actually to start with the local questions, sort of the slice and package a global problem that is often too overwhelming to actually think about to kind of the local kind of size. And this is the draft report that I referred to, where actually some consideration how we might be able to use such processes in New Zealand today going forward. Right, I can see that people have already started to ask some questions, and I want to raise this question: how will recruitment be large enough to capture the voices of minority groups in society? I'll start, like LGBTQ, Islam, disabled, and so forth. I'll start, and then Kristiann wants to add something. First of all, one thing that we didn't mention is that before we went in the deliberative process and after Watercare prepared, we actually opened to our process for submissions so we actually ran a kind of standard participatory process, and we invited groups that we knew had interest in water in Auckland, environmental groups, Manukau Restoration Harbour, Mana Whenua, to actually give their submissions. So we definitely invited other groups. So because you want to hear from people who may have strong views about this, whatever the question is. Second, what I want to say is that you can design the process with any kind of buckets you want. So if you really, if it's a question that you find that you really must have other communities that, for instance, we didn't think, for instance, like we added, as Kristiann said, to our standard demographic buckets, we added this home owning and renting because we thought that this was relevant for the question of should we have rainwater tanks, or should we, build, I don't know, desalination plants in, I don't know, in Tasman Sea or in Waitemata Harbour, but it can be something else. And the third thing that I want to say is that no, these processes will never capture everybody. They're not, and this is, the big criticism of them, that they're always going to be a small slice of population. Their philosophy is that we do our best to present as diverse views as we can, and then allow them time to actually become really informed and really and create this kind of community in which they can deliberate and discuss things. And we kind of believe that this is a better way to make communal decisions. But whether this is going to really capture everybody's views, I don't think that anybody can make that kind of claim for even if you had a deliberative process that had 300 people. Yeah.
Thanks, Tatjana. Now we have some other questions, I think, in the Yeah.
There was one more, yeah.
Yeah, one more, please. Who is that? I'm quite sure who it is. Whoever it is, please go.
Yeah, to what extent would the outcomes reflect the preconception of the researchers in a way that the question is framed, or the selection of material provided? I mean, I would say yes, absolutely. There's the question is framed so that it answers the question that the organization needs to have answered, and there will be, while we actually asked people whether they have other ideas, it is highly unlikely. It sort of really depends on what kind of question you're asking, right? If you're asking what should be the next source of water, it's kind of quite unlikely that people who come from outside are going to have ideas that are sort of have not been thought of by experts. If you're asking some other question, it is quite possible that their lived experiences or their professions might give them some other ideas. I don't know, Kristiann, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's really two questions in one here. One is about the remit, so the question that's being asked and the remit that's being given, and the options that were embedded within that. And I think the other is the selection of material, which is really interesting, because of course, you can frame things, as you say, you can frame things out of scope and in scope. And one of the things that the relationship with KOI2 was really meant to do, and I hope that we did accomplish, I think we did, was to be very sure that we were as broad as possible, and not being single-minded and having a single focus in the type of evidence that was being presented. So I'll just give you a quick example. Under some government administrations, the only type of evidence that matters is going to be, how much will this cost? What is the CBACs, they call it, the cost benefit analysis. And so our goal was to really be much broader than that, looking at, of course, cost, but also, as you saw, those other criteria. And so we looked for the type of expert who could respond to those other criteria as well that were involved in the decision making, and try to really reach out as broadly as we could. Not just, and actually, to their credit, WaterCare was very clear that, if possible, don't talk to just our in-house experts. They were quite concerned about the sort of perception of conflict of interest. And they said, go broad, go overseas, go to Australia, to the UK, to Israel, wherever you can, to find experts who can speak to this. And I think that really elevated the level of trust in the process, that it wasn't strictly in-house, and that we were able to broker that knowledge coming from others.
Thank you, Kristiann. We have a question from Jack, Santa Barbara.
Is that actually a question from Joanna?
From Hello, Joanna.
I'm quite convinced that it's a better way to make decisions of public policy. I'm concerned about the costs.
Yes.
I would like to see it institutionalized eventually, but I need to understand more about costs.
So there's a kind of interesting thing about the cost. I mean, there's no doubt that, organizing a citizens' jury is a lot more expensive than, creating an online survey and then sending it to everybody in the Auckland Council database, right? It's clearly the case. But what I found really interesting is in the first phase of our process, first phase of our project, as Kristiann showed on that scheme, we talked to a number of engagement professionals, and they told us that they get these surveys back, and they and clearly the problem with a lot of these participatory surveys is that people who participate are those who have very strong opinions, right? So you get, I mean, he talks about the example of Takapuna City Centre, where it seemed from the online survey or whatever the other surveys that they did, that people were against reducing the number of parking spots, right? But then when they actually went, hired a sort of marketing agency and went out and tried to ask a sort of more random sample of population of Takapuna, they got quite an opposite result. So if you ask, yes, so you know, there were people who had reasons to be against, or like had strong views, and maybe their demographics was different, but once they got out of a community. So the thing is that, and that kind of then ended up being obviously a lot more expensive, hiring the marketing agency and going there and then analyzing, then, you know, running your online survey. So it is more costly, that's for sure. But the question is, and then I mean, how much does a wrong decision cost? What is the real cost of, you know, making a big mistake? No, like truly. And you know, I was also thinking like, and this is something that I wrote in Newsroom, is what if we, instead of running this board of inquiry about this horrible dread East-West link that cost I don't know how many millions of dollars, because the lawyers were paid whatever lawyers are paid, we ran a citizens assembly that would have cost not in the order of like hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you know, had kind of people come to the decisions, right? And that seems sort of odd, but actually would have probably created, and we wouldn't maybe necessarily ask them the kind of, but the question would have to be different too, because you wouldn't ask them, how do we build a motorway and then mitigate the environmental consequences? Like you would actually ask a kind of a proper question, is like, how do we connect East and West Auckland so that it's economically productive, but at the same time environmentally, you know, sort of advantageous. So, you know, yeah, that's kind of my answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
yes.
while you're here, can I ask a question?
Go do, Jack.
With respect to the councils, the elected officials, I'm curious as to what you found with how they saw this process. Did they see it as an aid to their deliberations and their decision making, or did they see it as a usurpation of their authority?
Interesting.
I mean, I think you've nailed it in terms of what the question really was, is do they see it as taking the place of their own authority? And I think Tatjana alluded to this earlier, as well as with Mana Whenua, there was skepticism at first, and you know, you start to see people asking, well, what are we here for? This is our job. You know, the process is about elected officials making decisions on behalf of those who elected them. But we all know that the electoral process itself can be quite flawed. And so I think the skepticism initially, and as we went along, and as we talked to you know, local board members in particular, and sort of socialized a little bit more what we were doing and what it was about, you could see some light bulb moments with people and people coming around and understanding. I don't know if Tatjana, you've probably got a more critical view of
well, I mean, to be honest, it's we did try to reach before the process some elected members in local boards and in council, and we like at that point of time we got some responses, and I can't say that we really surveyed them, so we have a really good idea. But what Kristiann mentioned, I think at the start, is that my student wrote a master's dissertation, and she interviewed some sort of a mix, not so many local government politicians, but more MPs and some ministers. And I suppose what she found is that there was a kind of a party politics split, in which Green Party was quite open to the idea of deliberative democracy. And in fact, I believe that there was Chloe Swarbrick actually wanted to try to run a deliberative citizens assembly on cannabis reform, and that prior to the referendum. And because, as you know, you may know about the Irish case, some countries have actually run sort of incorporated citizens assembly into the referendum. They first actually sort of trialed the question and the citizens assembly, and then kind of went to the national referendum. And that idea was not accepted by the Labour New Zealand First government. And then, so to kind of, his sense was that Green Party was generally in favour, Labour and National were generally not in favour. But this is again kind of generalizing a lot, and on a fairly small sample of politicians in New Zealand. So I think it was about 17 interviews. So yeah, but it's something that we actually want to, and we are planning to present our findings to the local boards. So there was I can see Peter and Glenn, and there was also a question in the chat. I don't know, Kristiann, do you want to take this one in the? Sorry.
Just need to see.
There was Barbara, we haven't answered to this one. Very interesting. Thank you. Can you speak to who will issue the remit?
Oh, yes.
Or with the local question, how might us as citizens persuade our local authority council to run a citizens assembly on climate change? Oh, and I think we also skipped another question. Oh, sorry, maybe we can come back. So how could we persuade our local?
Do what you do best. Be activist. I mean, well, wherever there's an opportunity to talk about how consultation is done, or even within the consultative process itself, you know, advertise and put in a plug for doing things differently is a short and quick answer to that. I mean, it's the perennial problem is needing that demand, and needing the demand to come from you know, somebody who has the mana, to the authority to issue a remit that will be a remit of consequence. So wherever there is an opportunity to talk about this as a tool of democracy, then please do so. We all have that kind of agency. I'm not sure that actually answers it. There's probably better ways, Tatjana.
Yeah, I just want to say that there are internationally, there were cases in Belgium where, you know, groups of citizens started deliberative processes, and that was not kind of done with you know, sort of an authority like government or public organization. I think it is kind of our choice and our research choice to work with these kinds of issues where we kind of want, because we started, as I said, with this sort of like, how do we move the policy along? So, you know, this is where our research, it doesn't mean that there are not ways in which kind of the question is like, if you are running your own sort of citizens assembly that comes from the sort of citizens initiative, then you have this kind of problem of how do you then persuade the, you know, whatever the decision-making body there is, right? So
accountability.
We are interested. This is kind of a different thing. So sorry, there were a couple of questions, and then this, I don't know.
Well, we've got Peter Glensall with his hand up for a question.
Yeah.
Peter, unmute. Unmute, Peter. Peter, you need to unmute.
Yep, I was just doing that. Kia ora, everyone. I'm part of a group, Te Reo Ngā Tangata in Porirua, working with Ngāti Toa to develop a Te Treaty-based Citizens Assembly on climate change in Porirua. So we are so pleased to hear of your experience in Auckland, and are looking forward offline to even more detailed conversation with you about some of the mechanics. Two questions from me. Firstly, about the operation of a citizen assembly and its findings. Do I take it from what you've said that we will shortly, or have we already heard from the CEO of Watercare Services, that Watercare Services is now going to pursue the option of direct recycling of wastewater as their first and primary option to increase the availability of water for Auckland? And the second question is to do with Maori engagement. The whole assembly began because of the statement from Mana Whenua that they will not increase the take of water from the Waikato River. And that was a bottom line. So that was not even considered as an option for the assembly because of that statement. Were there any other bottom lines from Mana Whenua which were also taken off the table? I was interested, for example, that for many Māori, the option of consuming water that has been part of human waste would be completely antithetical and unacceptable, no matter how many times it was recycled. So were there any other mana whenua or tangata whenua issues which meant options were taken off the table?
Can I just address the first part, and then you, Kristiann, can talk about the kind of the Maori and the kind of culture. And the first part is yes, they are going to. So the thing, what they said is Watercare did not say, well, they committed to implementing this, but they implement things within the regulatory and legal framework, which means that the first thing for them to do is actually to see how this would comply with taumata arowae, health, and all of that. I mean, we have the response. We just got actually, it was yesterday, the 1st of November. Yesterday was 1st of November, sorry. So yesterday, the Board of Watercare responded to the citizen recommendations, and they kind of laid out the things that they need to do to sort of ascertain whether direct water as a source complies with all the health, because as you know, we also have the new health standards around taumata arowae and regulatory water, and in New Zealand more than ever, there's after the Have a Look North, there's awareness around the potential health risks. So they're taking that, although like, you know, there's work to be done. So yes, they're going to pursue that with, if that, you know, they can kind of comply with everything that needs to be done for that to be fully safe, right? And then Kristiann, do you want to talk about the recycling?
Yeah, sure. No, it's a great question. And it was, we were concerned about that as well, obviously. And the advice that we had from our Māori collaborators was to sort of alerting us, you know, to the understanding of from a Te Ao Māori perspective. But what became clear over the course of the multiple sessions, and definitely much clearer when we heard from the Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum, was first of all, the balancing of values, where kaitiakitanga can trump anything. And so if kaitiakitanga is your #1 value, and this is a discussion, a negotiation of these values, and then understanding that this is about recycling, this is about not putting salty brine into the Hauraki Gulf, for instance, this is the most environmental option. So that immediately came up to the surface. And the second thing that was well noted was when we heard from the Kaitiaki Forum, one of the first messages they had for us was, we are 21st century Māori. We understand the issues that we're facing collectively. We understand that, you know, decisions need to be made and we need to be practical. And so there was a very robust and fulsome conversation around the ideas of tapu and noa. You know, how do you make something noa and for lack of a better word, palatable, according to tikanga. And that was the message, like, this can be done. We can be practical about this, but it needs to be done in a way that meets other elements of tikanga, so on our terms. So that was the second message. And then I guess the third message was, of course, the difference between tangata whenua and mana whenua holders. And so when you're dealing with a particular roha, when you're dealing with a particular place, and if you're citing a particular piece of infrastructure, large infrastructure in a particular roha, then there's a duty to, and a moral duty, as well as a treaty obligation to work directly with mana whenua. And so we couldn't conflate what we were hearing necessarily from, you know, a broader sense of Te Ao Māori from tangata whenua perspective, and conflate that with what would happen on a case-by-case basis with mana whenua. And so as Watercare goes forward, then looking at, you know, where they would position and site their infrastructure, of course they know that they would need to be working very closely through their Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum with the specific rohe that's involved. Yeah.
I would like to, well, Jack, you want, I'll.
There was also a question, can I answer? There's a question that's been sitting there
Yeah.
from sorry, Raybon's, I don't know. So why do you believe that 40 people who agreed to participate from 12,000 invitations representing a random sample, would they not be as highly selective as achieved by survey? First of all, it wasn't 40 who replied, it was around 320. And that's generally what was found overseas. Between 3 and 5% of people agreed to participate. So ours was on the lower side, but I should also say this was at the start of the big COVID wave in July. So we had to kind of wrestle with the whole thing. Will people come to an in-person thing during the COVID time? So it was a little bit low. But what is interesting is, so out of these 300 something, we selected 40, right? And what is interesting that in both on this group this year, as in our 4 short workshops that we ran last year, in which we had 4 times 30 people, so 120 people, so 30 people in Manukau, 30 people in North Shore, 30 people in Central Auckland, and 30 people in Henderson. We had people who had, overwhelmingly, we had people who had never participated in any kind of submission, survey, anything, really. And we had people, we had Pacific people, we had, sort of young, really young people. We had, people who would never, and when you ask them, like, why didn't you? Well, I said, like, well, I didn't even know that this is happening. I didn't even know that I can. I didn't even know how. So I would say, no, I think these are people actually quite different from, someone like me who, goes to and writes to Board of Inquiry and like stands there and was insulted by a judge. But no, I think they're quite different. But you're right that mini publics become different just through this, these people now through this participation in this process, they have become quite different. And someone else, and I'm sort of replying to another question here, and what is the kind of where was it there? Someone sort of like, what was the feedback of the participants on their sense of agency for long-term engagement as active citizens? Now, I don't know what they're going to do as we still have some post-evaluation surveys that we need to analyze because it's only a month left and it's during the teaching semester for us. But from what we heard from them is that they have certainly they really are interested in this water process, and they've been asking us, so what is going to happen next? Can you give us a schedule? Can you give us a sort of check? And they have become quite sort of enthusiastic proponents of citizens' assemblies. So they have become, so they're now different. They've changed.
They are the agents of change now, out there in the world.
Out there.
Okay, Jack, you have a question.
Yeah, it's a question about the facilitation process. How important was the skill of the facilitators? Did you have criteria for selecting facilitators, and how difficult was it to get the kind of skill level that you felt was necessary?
And Kristiann, you want to talk about?
Oh, Jack, you've anticipated all of our challenges. That's so true. It was difficult. We really lucked in with facilitators. We went initially to the Southern Initiative, which is a civil society organization out of Manukau in South Auckland, and really working very closely with especially Pacific communities, Māori and Pacifica communities there. And they were able to, this immediately clicked, with them, and they understood exactly where it was coming from, the process, everything else. And we're able to recommend a few people. And of course, then you run into the problem of everybody who has these skills is really in demand and stretched very thinly, in particular, if they are Māori or Pacifica. And this is, one of our key findings in this whole sort of proof of concept process has been capacity building for Aotearoa New Zealand. There are only really a few people, certainly in Auckland, there are elsewhere, obviously, as well. And not least Peter, the group that you're working with, but, it's the capacity building problem is real. And we reached out to colleagues in Australia who sort of helped along the way entirely, handheld, really, remotely. And we're very closely connected with them in between sessions. Even our facilitator, for whom participatory deliberative work was relatively new. So she was very familiar with all of the sort of IAP kind of processes, but doing deliberative work in particular, she was learning as much as we were. However, we knew we were in good hands with her in terms of design skills and design principles, and really watched that unfold, you know, every time we met, which was very fortunate for us. So yes, the short answer is facilitation is hugely important.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, will this process, the water care citizens assemblies, come up with a manual, right, something which can therefore perpetuate and help other people along this path?
Yeah, great question. We've just had a meeting about that earlier this week and late last week. And the idea is maybe not so much sort of a recipe book manual, but certainly the design principles, sort of a checklist of what to be alert to. And then some of the basic design principles. And Tatjana kind of outlined many of those at the beginning around recruitment, around the type of remit, around the type of question that needed to be asked. And then, you know, not risking going down the track of very cookie cutter model, but at least having, like I said, those key issues to be alert to in a kind of a checklist kind of way.
Great. Are there other questions in the chat that we've missed? Has anybody else anything to say? I wanted actually to bring up a word that I've come across in my reading about citizens' assemblies, and that's the word sortition, which we're talking about, Tatjana, but you actually, I don't think, used the word, or you did earlier on. And it raises the question of course, is sortition infallible? Is it really possible to address or to have represented there the demographic and socioeconomic cross-section? What do you feel about that?
I mean, look, these, you know, you would have a much, if you invited 12,000 people and 5,000 responded, that would be much better for us, right? I mean, we would have a better sample to choose. And that does happen in some countries that people have responded. To some extent, this is also about, and this is, you know, what I alluded to a little bit when I said that the fourth wave of deliberative democracy is deliberative systems. It's really about kind of building a culture in which there's also not only there's more processes, but also there's an expectation of citizens and understanding that it is kind of the, you know, civil duty in a way. It's not it's kind of participating in the processes. So you can be invited in the same way that you know, invited to be a part of a criminal jury, right? And you go there and you sort of sit, but this is really actually more fun, and it's nicer because you're building, you know, a better future. And you kind of sit and you decide, you know, sort of you discuss water or climate or, you know, food or whatever the problem is. And in that sense, you know, potentially people then become more alert, become more sort of accepting, kind of expected. It's not strange because we don't, you know, we know who accepted. We don't know why people who received it and didn't accept, why they didn't. I mean, one thing that we didn't mention is that we had financial compensation, and this is always the case with citizens' assemblies, because you cannot get the kind of people you want in the room if you don't provide financial compensation. You feed them. We provided childcare of some sort, like either bring children into the room and we had students who looked after them, or we gave them some supermarket vouchers if they can find family. And, you know, sort of we provided transport where it was needed. We provided help for people who were disabled in the room. So actually it was all about how do we ensure that, and this is why we wrote Manakitanga as one of our principles, in addition to kind of the usual principles of citizen assembly, because this is how, you know, you make it easy. But there must have been, a lot of people who received this and were just confused what this was, right?
Yes. Yes.
I also have to say that there were a lot of people who received our invitation way too late, because we've learned that we cannot rely on New Zealand Post and that you cannot deliver in Auckland in 2 weeks' time. That is, you cannot actually count on that.
Yes.
In their defense, New Zealand Post did allow us to use their database.
Yeah.
The
Sure.
process, but
Right.
that's where it ended. Really,
That's where it ended. Yeah, that was kind of, we kept on like receiving some positive responses after we closed, and we had some other kind of issues to start. So my kind of sense is that yes, like and there is some really interesting work on deliberative systems that's currently being done internationally by academics, and that I think kind of is the answer when you get closer to, but it's never going to be, it's never perfect. It's all we do is like we make little steps towards.
Could we perhaps finish with asking, could I ask Peter about Porirua and what, if this talk has helped you, or if there are specific issues which are special to Porirua?
Kia ora anō, and I noticed there are a couple of others of our group who are on the call, so I'll just very quickly begin. We are extremely excited in the partnership work we are doing with Ngāti Toa Rangatira, and what has emerged is that a citizens' assembly in the vision of Ngāti Toa Rangatira is simply one arrow in a complex way of making that city more community engaged and more democratic. So the first arm of that double hulled canoe has the tentative name of a talanoa, which comes from the Pacific tradition of people gathering to talk. And this will be a gathering of leaders from throughout the city, of anyone who aspires and can claim a leadership status of any sort, to be gathered together under the hosting of Ngāti Toa to talk about issues that are of importance for that city, and that will be an ongoing process. So that's a vision that begins that process of general democracy. The first question that the Talanoa, when it meets on the 3rd of December, will be asked is, are you willing to support a citizens' assembly here in Porirua, which will address the issue of climate change? And that's when we will kick in all of the learnings that Koitu is developed in Auckland, and that we, from a massive process of community engagement, hope to get more than 320 people saying that they would like to be part of a citizens' assembly, and we will then use sortition and find a way so that it is, the big difference will be that this assembly will be co-designed and co-hosted by Ngāti Toa Rangatira. So the question will reflect Ngāti Toa's priorities as much as anyone else's. We're having good support from the Porirua City Council. We're having good support from the Climate Change Commission. And we are confident that this will be an exciting model for others. And we are committed to an ongoing process of evaluation, of review and assessment using Emily Beausoleil from Victoria University and a team of other people, as well as, we hope, drawing again on the Koitu example. So we're pretty excited by what's emerging here in Porirua. But Kelly and Rosalind at the very least, and Chris, I see, maybe you have any quick comments to add to my summary.
Right, well, we've reached time. There would have to be very quick comments, but thank you. That was a most interesting comment there. Okay, that's it. All right, well, thanks to Tatjana and Kristiann, and we will now take away with us this word, Citizens Assembly, which must, we hope, reverberate around. And thank you for your time.
Okay.
So good
Thank you
night.
so much for inviting us.
Right. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.